at the roots of the development of the theater. The culture of the Italian Renaissance has gone through several stages in its development. While the dominant role in the political life of Italy belonged to the city communes, the country's culture had distinctly expressed democratic features. Its initial foundations were laid by the giant of Italian poetry, Dante Alighieri, the last poet of the Middle Ages and at the same time the first poet of modern times. In his philosophical, journalistic treatises and especially in the Divine Comedy expressed the progressive ideals of the Italian communes. Acting ardent exposer of feudal anarchy and papacy, he condemned the interests of the upper strata of the urban bourgeoisie. Despite the relics of the Middle Ages in the worldview of Dante, in his work the main features of the new art, realism and nationality, were first approved, which were developed by the subsequent great figures of Italian humanism, Petrarch and especially Boccaccio. K. Marx and F. Engels, Manifesto of the Communist Party, Gospel Disdat, 1952, p. 29. Poetizing the personality of a person, the freedom of his judgments, the beauty and nobility of his feelings, Francesco Petrarca, 1304–1374, fought against the deadly scholasticism, destroying the church idols, contrasting them with the healthy ideals of ancient art. Especially brightly realistic and popular beginning of a new culture and art was manifested in the work of the greatest realist of the Italian Renaissance, Giovanni Boccaccio, 1313–1375. In his poems and short stories, a new Renaissance man, free from religious asceticism and feudal prejudices, animated by cheerful free-thinking, passionately in love with life and equally passionately indignant at every manifestation of church hypocrisy, aristocratic parasitism and bourgeois self-interest, rose to his full height. With particular force, Boccaccio's democratic democratism expressed itself in his fiery words against the tyrant. He is an enemy. To plot against him, to take up arms against him, to set up traps for him, to oppose him with force is a matter of high spirit, holy and most necessary, for there is no more sacrifice pleasing to God than the blood of a tyrant. If the ideas of humanism were ultimately the expression of the awakened forces of the people, then the outlook of the masses in itself still largely preserved the religious coloring, and therefore the anti-feudal aspirations of the people were expressed in the wide dissemination of all kinds of heretical movements. Heresies, opposed to the official church, were born in free cities, among the masses of disadvantaged people who were victims of economic and social conditions. Supporters of heresies, preaching severe asceticism, denouncing the venality and licentiousness of the clergy, not only called for abstinence and moral purity, but also demanded help to the poor, an equal division of property of the rich. Heresies were not only a religion, but also an expression in the religious form of social ideals, demands of the poorest sections of the population, who spoke with the idea of equality. The isolation of humanism from the people and the spread of heretical teachings among the masses affected the state of the Italian theater of the early Renaissance period. Humanistic ideology, weakly penetrating the masses, could not subordinate the theater to itself. Anti-feudal tendencies, new national features arose in the theater under the influence of heresies. These new features, in themselves very important for the further development of the theater, could not immediately change the medieval form of representation. In the 14th century, a liturgical drama in Latin continued to exist everywhere in Italy. This genre of medieval church theater, which had already disappeared in most of Europe, was artificially supported by the Catholic Church in Italy. Along with the Latin liturgical drama since the second half of the 13th century, when heretical movements intensified, so-called lauds began to spread in Italy, religious laudatory songs. They were sung by crowds of flagellants, i.e., beatings, sectanti fanatics who walked from city to city and in half-mad ecstasy lashed themselves with whips on the naked body. Mystical and content, These lauds possessed pronounced anti-clerical and at times even satirical features. Their language was distinguished by great imagery and energy. The poetic dimensions of the laudes were predominantly folk. Their melodies were also borrowed from folk sources. The motifs of carnival, comic and love songs were adapted to the laureate. Songs were often accompanied by dances. Especially expressive were the laudes, composed by the Tuscan monk Jacopo da Torre, 1220–1306, a fierce enemy of the papal curia. While preaching the severe ideals of asceticism, he passionately condemned the parasitism of the rich and the profligacy of monks. His satire was heard even by the Pope Boniface VIII himself. Using the traditions of folk storytellers and novelists, the creators of the lauda, and first of all Jacopone, began to give them a dialogical form. These dialogues were originally performed during marches, but already in the XIV century they acquired the character of an independent spectacle, represented in one definite place, in costumes and with props. In the earliest collection of Laud Monastery of the Order of Disciplines, there were special instructions on how to perform lauds, with detailed explanations of the necessary movements. Immediately listed are the necessary in the course of the performance costumes and props: cross, nail, pillar, dove. Lauda in the form of dialogue gradually grew into religious ideas, which continue to exist in the XV century. Plots of these representations are predominantly evangelical scenes: the birth of Christ, the Annunciation. Despite the fact that in these scenes there were some everyday, realistic moments, the folk tendencies of the ancient lauda were completely eliminated. The Church, destroying heresies or introducing them into the mainstream of official religion, subordinated to itself the theatrical genre, caused by the heretical movement. Representations, generated by the lauda, have now become canonical church spectacles. The rebellious element of them completely disappeared. In the XV century, regardless of the laud, the so-called sacred representations, sacra rappresentazioni, a genre close to the mystery prevalent in the northern countries of Europe, arose and became widespread. The first known text of the sacred representation dates back to 1448. This is The Picture of Abraham and Isaac by Theo Belgari. The isolation of the ideas of humanism from living modernity, from theatrical practice, with special obviousness is revealed precisely on the analysis of sacred representations. Writing texts of sacred ideas, humanist poets were completely subordinated to the traditional canons of this genre. Such large representatives of the Florentine poetic school as Luigi Pulci, the author of the famous parody poem, Big Morgue, or Lorenzo de' Medici, the ruler of Florence, poet and humanist, the creator of the famous carnival songs, in nothing dramatized their humanistic worldview. A characteristic example in this respect is the representation of the Saints John and Paul by Lorenzo de' Medici, 1489. The plot of this play was a church legend, partially used in the 10th century for the religious drama, Gallican, by the nun Grotsviedgandersheim. The action of the sacred representation began with the miraculous cure from the leprosy of the daughter of Emperor Constantine Constans. In gratitude to the sky, Constans gave a vow of celibacy. There was also the commander Gallican, who asked the emperor for the hand of Constantia as a reward for his victories. The emperor gave an evasive answer. He could not refuse Gallic, he could not, because at that time a new attack was being prepared for the country and the commander needed the emperor. But at the same time Constantine did not want to force his daughter to violate the word given to the sky. On the battlefield Gallican walked with two righteous young men, John and Paul, and at the first battle was defeated. The young men told him that the whole reason for Gallican's unbelief was that he was not a Christian, but a pagan. Gallican, having heeded these words, was praying to Jesus, and an angel came down from heaven, who reported that Christ was sending an army back to the converted Christian. Gallican led the soldiers to the enemy and won a complete victory. Arriving now to the emperor, He demanded the promised reward, the hand of Constantia, but then the emperor informed Gallicanus about the vow of his daughter. The commander praised the act of the girl and informed Constantine that he himself converted to the Christian faith and also decided to give up secular life and retire to the monastery. The emperor himself comes to the same decision. He renounces the throne and hands over power to his eldest son. The new emperor knows the vanity of the world from the first year of government. The rebellious subjects kill his two brothers and destroy their troops. The emperor of grief dies. In the new rulers, the Roman Emperor Julian is elected. Upon receiving the throne, he sneers at Christianity and encourages the young men of John and Paul to renounce their faith, threatening them otherwise with death. Young men declare their decision to die for Christ, and they are immediately executed. Is the Virgin Mary and tells the angel Mercury to punish Julian for apostasy and the Christian blood that he shed. The idea of denying life laid down in the basis of this play and preaching the fanatical faith deprives the characters of the truth and the logic of behavior, makes events ridiculous. Only in rare cases do the living features break through in action. It is an episode of a joyful encounter between a healed daughter and his father, or Gallicanus' speech to his soldiers, to whom he promises a monetary reward for taking the enemy fortress. In general, the play is artificial, contrived. Only a simple, poetic language, so easy in its rhythms, graceful verse is given out in the author of this work of the poet of modern times. Yet the rest is in the most determined manner hostile to a new worldview and a new poetic culture. A. Poliziano with his pupil Giuliano Medici detail of the fresco by Di Ghirlandaio in the Church of Santa Trinita in Florence. If in the XIV century in the field of painting religious themes were filled with fresh breath of life, real people became the heroes of church frescoes, as was, for example, Giotto. Then in the theater, even in 100 years, the genre of sacred representations remained dry and dead, not animated by the trend new art. It was obvious that the humanists wrote these plays on a template and, creating works for the people, believed that the masses must preserve their old beliefs and prejudices. Participation in the creation of sacred ideas was for the humanists a private episode of their activity. Mainly medieval genres were condemned by people of the new culture as a gross and ignorant product of the Dark Ages. But, despite the fact that humanists did not see anything worthy in the medieval theater, their first experience in the drama was associated with the use of forms of mystery, the most common theatrical genre of the XV century. In 1480, a young court poet and a remarkable connoisseur of antiquity, Angelo Poliziano, 1454-1494, commissioned by Cardinal Francesco Gonzaga, wrote for 2 days a pastoral play, The Tale of Orpheus. The play was part of the program of a great court festival. In the play, the plot of which was taken from the Greek myth, a new, humanistic worldview was affirmed, the glorification of life and its joys. The image of Orpheus, taming his inspired lure of evil, propitiating death and lords of the underworld, symbolized victory over asceticism, the triumph of human feelings. Orpheus, returning from Aida's wife Eurydice, again lost her and after that refused to love women. For this he was avenged by the Bacchante, who saw in his act a violation of the natural law of life. The very death of Orpheus was the argument in favor of a new, optimistic outlook. The play depicted the love of Eurydice to shepherd Aristide. His feelings flowed freely in beautiful octaves and sounded like an expression of the true truth of experience. This was especially noticeable when compared with the deadly phraseology of the enamored Gallican and the purely ascetic morality of the notion of St. John and Paul. The whole poetic atmosphere of the Tale of Orpheus is permeated with a bright, cheerful feeling, grace and sincerity, but at the same time, the actions and vicissitudes of Orpheus were poetically stylized, abstract in nature and gave rise to a new form of drama connected with life, could not. The new content, not yet fully defined in its realistic essence, was poured into the old, conditional form, which was quite natural for the transition period. According to the mystery canon, the legend of Orpheus began as a prologue. Only Archangel Gabriel spoke this prologue, and the winged messenger of the gods of Olympus is Mercury. As in the mysteries, Orpheus did not have a division into acts, and the action took place according to the simultaneous principle, in different places, somewhere on earth, then in hell. Remain conditional mysterial remarks. Orpheus says so, Aristide escapes to Eurydice says so, etc. In the contradictory combination of the new content and the old form, the leading part belonged to content, and therefore it is natural that in the process of developing a new direction in the theater it inevitably had to find an adequate form for itself. The decisive role in this respect was played by the appeal of humanists to the experience of ancient drama. This process went in parallel with the statements of sacred representations and the experience of Poliziano and wore at first a strictly closed character. In the 70s of the 15th century, the humanist Pomponio Leto, 1427–1497, among the teachers of the newly founded university, was attracted to him by his scholarship and passionate antiquity to him by many students. German scientist Nikolai Kuzanski and Italian humanist Poggio Bracciolini have found several previously unknown comedies of Plautus. The scientist began to carefully study the found, and Pomponio decided to recreate in ancient Rome in all details the ancient Roman theater. With his students he organized this theater in his house. The plays of Plautus and Terence were written in the language of the original. The scene was small. In the background, there were columns, between which hung curtains, and thus several cabins were formed on the stage. They depicted the houses of characters, whose names were written on the pediment of the corresponding cabin. See the picture on page 158. The news of the experiments of Pomponio soon spread all over Italy. His endeavor became fashionable, and the Roman models began to imitate. This was the first stage in the development of ancient drama. However, the Latin language was not understood by everyone, and therefore in the late 1470s, the Ferrara humanist Guarino first translated Plautus and Terence, thereby beginning the second period in mastering the legacy of the Roman theater. Eunuch Terence on the stage of humanists. 1493. In 1486 in Ferrara in the palace of the ducal castle on a specially constructed stage were put Menachmi plot in a new translation of Niccolò da Correggio with interludes. This idea produced such a sensation that Ferrara for a long time became the capital of theatrical Italy. Year after year, 1487, 1491, 1493, 1501 there were performances of Roman comedies in Italian translation. The performances were moved from the courtyard to the inner chambers of the palace. Particularly magnificent were the festivities in the beginning of 1502 on the occasion of the marriage of the Crown Prince of Ferrara, Alfonso d'Este, with the papal daughter Lucrezia Borgia. 5 comedies were presented, each of which was a whole evening. Among the acts were interludes, ballet pantomimic performances on the subjects of ancient myths. The theater has a repertoire, the works of Plautus, Terence and Seneca in Italian translations. In those same years, Poliziano wrote a play known to us, The Tale of Orpheus. His innovation was adopted so decisively that with Poliziano began the proliferation of mythological plays. By the time it coincided with the period of greatest fascination with the production of antique comedies in Italian translations, both directions gradually converged, borrowing from each other different elements of the stage embodiment and dramatic technique. The wide circles of society are beginning to be interested in the theater, but mythological plays and Roman comedies could not go beyond the confines of a limited environment. Translations of Plautus and Terence interested mainly people educated, specially engaged in antiquity. The very content of these plays was far from modern life. Mythological plays, emphatically aristocratic in nature, were too far-fetched and pretentious and therefore not popular with the wide audience. In addition, the production of these plays was very expensive. The further evolution of the Italian theater was to go along the line of democratization of the spectacle. It could only happen if the art was brought closer to reality. Only then the ancient drama could impregnate the process of creating a new drama, reflecting the conflicts of modernity. However, at the core of its Italian drama it did not have a genuine nationality. It was peculiar to book, pedantic imitation of ancient specimens. It is in connection with this that the Italian comedy was given the name of an academic comedy. Adopted relatively a narrow audience,